Spring of 1849, Oakmont Plantation, South Carolina. A wealthy patriarch forces his only son to witness something no child should see, the systematic breeding of enslaved women in the estate's locked western quarters. The son sits paralyzed in a velvet chair, 12 years old, watching his father approach a terrified woman named Miriam with clinical precision. But here's what the historical records tried to bury. One of those children born in that room would eventually burn the entire Oakmont fortune to ash, collapse one of the South's most powerful families, and expose a breeding operation so calculated, so documented, it would later be used as evidence in congressional hearings about the true nature of American slavery. How does a child born into bondage destroy the empire built on his mother's suffering? Before we continue into this labyrinth of depravity and revenge, subscribe and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from and what time it is there. If you want access to exclusive, uncensored content about history's most disturbing crimes and hidden atrocities, consider becoming a member. And don't forget to hit that like button. Now, you have to understand, South Carolina in the 1840s wasn't just complicit in slavery, it was the beating heart of it. The low-country plantations stretched for thousands of acres, their fields thick with Sea Island cotton that made men wealthier than kings. Charleston's elite didn't just own slaves. They built an entire philosophical and pseudo-scientific framework to justify it, publishing treatises in medical journals claiming biological superiority, hiring ministers who twisted scripture into chains. I want you to picture this: grand plantation houses with imported Italian marble, crystal chandeliers from France, libraries filled with leather-bound books on agriculture and bloodlines. Bloodlines, that's the key word here. These men were obsessed with purity, with legacy, with ensuring their names and fortunes passed down through legitimate white heirs. The air in these places smelled of magnolia and tobacco, but underneath it all was the scent of sweat, blood, and fear emanating from the slave quarters. Spanish moss hung from ancient oaks like funeral shrouds, and at night you could hear the songs from the quarters, spirituals that carried coded messages of suffering and survival. This was a world where a man's worth was measured in acres and human property, where the law protected white patrimony above all else, and where the greatest fear wasn't slave rebellion, it was the contamination of the bloodline. The nightmare of mixed-race children claiming what was never meant to be theirs. Colonel Richard Thornhill wasn't some cartoonish villain twirling a mustache. He was respected, even admired. Let's be real, this man sat on the Charleston Agricultural Society, donated generously to the Episcopal Church, and hosted lavish parties where senators and judges sipped his imported bourbon. He was tall, silver-haired, impeccably dressed in tailored waistcoats, the kind of man who could quote Virgil in Latin and calculate crop yields in his head. His neighbors called him a visionary, a patriarch who ruled his 1,200-acre empire with what they termed firm but fair governance, which was their polite way of saying he brutalized human beings with calculated efficiency. But here's what they didn't talk about at those garden parties. Richard Thornhill had a problem that terrified him more than any slave uprising. His son, Charles, born from his late wife Eleanor, who died in childbirth, was sterile, confirmed by 3 different physicians in Charleston and Savannah. The Thornhill line, stretching back 5 generations to English nobility, would die with Charles, and Richard couldn't accept that. This is where the story gets truly chilling, because Richard didn't just want heirs, he wanted to control exactly how they came into existence. He began viewing his enslaved women not as human beings, but as vessels, as breeding stock that could carry his genetic legacy forward while maintaining his absolute legal ownership of the resulting children. The man kept ledgers, detailed records of bloodlines among his slaves like a horse breeder tracking thoroughbreds. To the outside world, Richard Thornhill was simply being a prudent plantation owner, nothing more. He'd publicly announced his intention to improve the quality of his labor force through selective breeding, a practice that was not only legal but actually encouraged in agricultural journals of the era. Other planters nodded approvingly when he explained his system at gentlemen's clubs over cigars and brandy. He'd identified his strongest male slaves and his most suitable female slaves, he told them, and was carefully managing reproduction to create healthier, more valuable workers. This wasn't cruelty, he insisted. This was modern agricultural science. The same principles applied to cattle and horses now being applied to maximize plantation efficiency. He even had documentation, breeding charts displayed in his study, medical examinations conducted by Dr. Silas Pemberton, who certified the genetic quality of his slaves, and financial projections showing how this program would increase his property values by thousands of dollars. When neighbors occasionally noticed Richard spending unusual amounts of time with certain enslaved women, particularly the light-skinned, educated Miriam who worked in the main house, he had a perfectly reasonable explanation. He was personally overseeing the breeding program to ensure its success, monitoring the women's health, confirming pregnancies. It was hands-on management, he claimed, the mark of a dedicated proprietor. And society accepted this because it fit neatly into their existing framework. Slavery was business, slaves were property, and what a man did with his property was his own concern, protected by law and sanctified by custom. But behind that respectable facade, Richard had constructed something far more calculated and disturbing. In 1845, he'd built what he called the breeding house, a separate structure hidden behind a grove of live oaks, far enough from the main quarters that screams wouldn't carry, but close enough to the main house that he could visit unobserved. Now, you have to understand, this wasn't some crude shack. This was a purpose-built facility with 4 private rooms, each containing a bed, a wash basin, and heavy locks on the outside of the doors. He kept meticulous records in leather-bound ledgers, dates, times, which women, projected conception periods, actual births. He'd installed his overseer, a brutal man named Clayton Hodge, as the keeper of this building, someone who asked no questions and kept other slaves away under threat of the whip. Richard had even arranged for Dr. Pemberton to make monthly visits, ostensibly to ensure the breeding stock remained healthy, but really to confirm pregnancies and estimate paternity based on the timing of his own visits. The infrastructure extended beyond the physical building. He'd created an entire system of control. Women selected for the breeding house were given slightly better rations, creating resentment and division among the enslaved population. He rotated them, never keeping the same woman there for more than a few months, ensuring no bonds formed, no resistance organized. And he kept a separate account book hidden in a false bottom of his desk, documenting which children were actually his, insurance, he thought, for his legacy. When questions did arise, and they occasionally did, Richard had rehearsed answers that satisfied the willfully blind society around him. Why did certain enslaved children on Thornhill Plantation have noticeably lighter skin, sometimes with green or gray eyes instead of brown? Richard would smile benevolently and explain that these were the natural results of his breeding program, the introduction of genetics from lighter-skinned slaves he'd purchased from Virginia and Maryland. Scientific, see? When his wife's sister, Margaret, visited from Richmond and noticed how one particular child, a boy named Samuel, born in 1848, bore an uncanny resemblance to the Thornhill family's distinctive cleft chin and high forehead, Richard calmly explained it was coincidental, that certain facial structures were common among people of mixed African and European descent. Dr. Pemberton backed him up with pseudo-scientific lectures about hereditary characteristics and recessive traits. When Charles, his sterile son, began spending increasing amounts of time locked in his room, drinking heavily and refusing to attend church, Richard told concerned neighbors his son was struggling with melancholy over his late mother, a grief Richard claimed he deeply understood. When enslaved women returned from the breeding house visibly traumatized, walking with their eyes downcast, speaking in whispers, Richard explained they were simply adjusting to their new maternal responsibilities, that childbirth was naturally taxing. And when Miriam, in particular, attempted to run away twice in 1849, Richard publicly punished her with 20 lashes and told everyone she'd been caught stealing, a common excuse that no one questioned because no one wanted to look closer. Dr. Silas Pemberton wasn't just complicit, he was essential to the entire operation, and he profited handsomely from it. This man had graduated from the Medical College of South Carolina, had a thriving practice among Charleston's elite, and presented papers at medical conferences about racial physiology. But let's be real about what he actually was, a man who provided scientific legitimacy to rape. Richard paid him $200 annually, more than most overseers earned, to make monthly visits to Thornhill Plantation, examine the enslaved women, confirm pregnancies, and most critically, to keep his mouth shut. Pemberton would arrive in his black carriage, medical bag in hand, and spend hours in the breeding house documenting reproductive health in clinical language that stripped away the humanity of what was happening. He wrote certificates declaring certain women fit for breeding purposes, examined children to estimate their percentage of white ancestry, and once even performed a forced abortion when Richard decided a particular pregnancy was inconvenient. Then there was Clayton Hodge, the overseer, a thick-necked brute from Georgia who'd been fired from 2 previous plantations for excessive violence. Which tells you something. Because excessive violence on a plantation took real effort. Richard hired him precisely because Hodge had no moral boundaries and desperately needed the work. Hodge kept the breeding house secure, prevented other slaves from interfering, and occasionally participated in Richard's program when instructed. He was paid in whiskey, a small house, and the unspoken permission to brutalize anyone who questioned the arrangement. Miriam wasn't randomly chosen. That's what makes this even more calculated and cruel. She was 23 years old in 1847, born on the plantation, taught to read by Richard's late wife Eleanor in direct violation of South Carolina law, which made her dangerously aware of her own oppression. I want you to picture this. A woman with sharp intelligence visible in her eyes, who spoke with careful diction, who'd been raised partially in the main house as Eleanor's personal attendant. She understood the white world in ways other enslaved people couldn't, which made her both valuable and threatening. Richard had watched her grow up, had noted her light brown skin. She was already mixed race, her grandmother having been raped by a previous overseer, and her refined features that would produce children who could almost pass for white. That's what he wanted. Children light enough to blur the lines, yet legally enslaved and under his complete control. There were others, of course. A woman named Bessie, dark-skinned and strong, who'd borne 11 children and survived them all being sold away. A girl named Ruth, barely 16, purchased specifically from a Virginia auction because Richard admired her breeding potential. A woman named Celia, who went mad after her 3rd forced pregnancy and had to be restrained in the quarters. But Miriam was different. She was the primary target, the one Richard visited most frequently, the one he decided would bear his true heir. She fought him the first time with fingernails and teeth. He had her whipped and came back the next night. Charles Thornhill was never supposed to see what his father was doing. But in the fall of 1847, at 24 years old, he stumbled into a truth that would poison the rest of his life. It happened on an October evening when Charles returned early from Charleston, where he'd been drinking away his shame at yet another failed courtship. What woman wanted a sterile husband who couldn't produce heirs? He entered Thornhill House through the kitchen entrance, intending to slip upstairs unnoticed, when he heard sounds coming from his father's study. Not business sounds, not conversation, something else. Now you have to understand, Charles already suspected his father's activities, had heard whispers from house slaves, had seen the breeding house and felt its wrongness in his gut. But suspecting and witnessing are violently different things. He crept to the study door, left slightly ajar, and through the gap he saw his father with Miriam bent over the mahogany desk, her face turned toward the door, tears streaming silently down her cheeks, her eyes meeting Charles's for one eternal moment of shared horror. Richard was so absorbed he didn't notice his son, but Miriam saw him, and in that moment something crystallized in Charles's alcohol-soaked mind. This woman was being forced to provide the heir he couldn't, was being used as a vessel for the Thornhill legacy because Charles's own body had failed. The shame, the rage, the complicity of his own existence, it all crashed over him at once. Charles didn't confront his father that night. He couldn't. Instead, he stumbled to his room, vomited into his wash basin, and drank himself unconscious with a bottle of whiskey he kept hidden under his bed. For 3 days he couldn't look at either his father or Miriam without his hands shaking. He stopped eating, stopped attending to plantation business, spent hours staring at the wall of his bedroom while his mind replayed that scene over and over. When he finally worked up the courage to approach his father, Richard was sitting in that same study, calmly reviewing cotton futures as if nothing had happened. "Father, I saw you," with Miriam, Charles whispered, his voice breaking. Richard didn't even look up from his papers. "You saw me managing my property," he replied coldly. "Ensuring the continuation of our family legacy since you've proven incapable of providing it." This is where the story gets truly chilling, because Richard didn't deny it. didn't apologize, didn't show even a flicker of shame. He explained it like a business transaction. Charles was sterile. The Thornhill name would die without intervention, and enslaved women were legally property to be used as their owner saw fit. The child Miriam carries is a Thornhill, Richard said, lighting his pipe. That's all that matters. Your squeamishness changes nothing. When Charles threatened to tell someone, anyone, Richard laughed. Tell who? The sheriff who owns 30 slaves himself? The judge who'll ask what law I've broken? You're naive, boy. Charles did try. God help him, he actually tried. In December 1847, he rode to Charleston and met with Judge Aldrich Whitmore, a family friend who'd known Charles since childhood. He sat in the judge's oak-paneled chambers and, with shaking hands, explained what his father was doing. Not just the rape, but the systematic breeding program, the hidden ledgers, the infrastructure of sexual violence. Judge Whitmore listened patiently, his face a mask of judicial neutrality, then leaned back in his leather chair and delivered a masterclass in plausible deniability. Charles, my boy, I understand you're distressed, but let's examine the facts legally, he began. Your father owns these women as property, correct? And property rights in South Carolina are absolute and sacred. They're the foundation of our entire society. What a man does with his property, provided he doesn't damage another white man's interests, is beyond the court's jurisdiction. The judge pulled out law books, showed Charles the actual statutes. Enslaved people had no legal standing to claim assault, no right to bodily autonomy, no protection under rape laws that explicitly applied only to white women. Even if what you're describing happened exactly as you say, Whitmore continued, no crime has been committed under South Carolina law. None. He suggested Charles was suffering from stress, perhaps the same melancholy that plagued him after his mother's death, and recommended rest and prayer. The judge then did something crushing. He wrote to Richard, informing him of Charles's visit, framing it as concern for the young man's mental state. By the spring of 1848, Miriam had changed in ways that couldn't be hidden or explained away. She was visibly pregnant, her belly swelling with Richard's child. But it was her eyes that told the real story. They'd gone flat, dead, like someone had reached inside and extinguished whatever spark made her human. She no longer spoke unless directly addressed, no longer made eye contact with anyone, moved through the main house like a ghost performing memorized tasks. The other enslaved women in the breeding house showed similar transformations. Bessie, who'd once been defiant and strong, now flinched at sudden movements and developed a stutter that made her nearly incomprehensible. Ruth, the 16-year-old, began pulling out her own hair in clumps until bald patches appeared across her scalp. Celia, the one who'd gone mad, was eventually chained in a storage shed because her screaming disturbed the main house. Richard told visitors she'd always been simple-minded, a genetic defect he was now careful to breed out of his stock. Let's be real. These women were walking evidence of atrocity, their bodies and minds bearing the physical scars of systematic sexual violence. But in a society that didn't recognize enslaved people as fully human, their trauma was invisible. When Charles pointed out Miriam's obvious deterioration to his father, Richard shrugged and said pregnancy made women emotional and irrational. It was natural, temporary, nothing to concern oneself with. Dr. Pemberton, ever the complicit professional, diagnosed these women with hysteria and nervous disorders common to their race, providing medical cover for psychological destruction. In June 1848, Charles discovered his father's hidden ledgers, and what he found was so methodical, so coldly calculated, it made the horror even worse. These weren't the ravings of a madman. This was science perverted into an instrument of control. Richard had created detailed charts tracking each woman's menstrual cycles, calculated optimal conception windows based on Dr. Pemberton's advice, and recorded every sexual encounter with clinical precision. Dates, times, positions used, whether the woman showed signs of ovulation. He'd even noted physical responses, whether they cried, fought, or went silent, as if documenting behavioral patterns in livestock. Now you have to understand, Richard had researched this. His library contained books on animal husbandry, agricultural breeding manuals from England, even controversial French medical texts about human heredity. He'd applied these principles systematically. He selected women based on physical characteristics he wanted to reproduce, avoided those with undesirable traits like dark skin or coarse features, and timed his assaults to maximize pregnancy likelihood. The ledgers revealed something even more disturbing. Richard was attempting to create a hierarchy of mixed-race children, ranking them by percentage of white ancestry, appearance, and projected value. He'd written notes like, "This specimen shows promising European features, and Miriam's child should be suitable for houseworker. Potential sale as high-value property." He'd even calculated the financial return on his breeding investment. Children of his own blood that he could sell for premium prices or keep as specially trained slaves. But Charles Thornhill was no hero. Not in the traditional sense. He was a broken alcoholic, sterile man consumed by self-loathing and rage. And that's precisely what made him dangerous to his father's empire. Let's be real, Charles didn't oppose slavery on moral grounds. He owned slaves himself, benefited from their labor, accepted the system completely. What destroyed him was something far more personal and petty. His father had publicly humiliated him, had built an entire breeding program as a monument to Charles's inadequacy, had created heirs from enslaved women because Charles's body had failed to perform its most basic aristocratic function. This wasn't righteousness. This was wounded pride mixed with shame and a desire for revenge that would take decades to ferment into action. Charles was 35 years old in 1858 when he began his true work. His hair already graying, his hands shaking from years of heavy drinking, his reputation in Charleston society completely ruined by public drunkenness and erratic behavior. He'd spent 10 years watching his father's program expand, watching Miriam's son Samuel grow into a light-skinned boy who carried Richard's cleft chin and cold eyes, watching his father parade this living evidence of Charles's failure around the plantation. But Charles had been doing something else during those years. He'd been studying law, quietly consulting with attorneys in Savannah and Richmond, asking hypothetical questions about inheritance, legitimacy, and the legal status of mixed-race children. He was planning something that would take patience, cunning, and a willingness to burn down everything his family had built. Charles's investigation wasn't dramatic. It was methodical, tedious, and took years of quiet documentation that no one noticed because everyone had already dismissed him as a useless drunk. He started by befriending the house slaves, particularly an elderly woman named Prudence, who'd served the Thornhill family for 40 years and remembered everything. Through careful conversations, usually late at night when he was supposedly passed out drunk, Charles gathered oral histories, which children on the plantation were actually Richard's. How many women had passed through the breeding house? What had happened to those who resisted or tried to escape? He copied pages from his father's hidden ledgers when Richard traveled to Charleston, meticulously reproducing the breeding charts, the financial calculations, the damning notes about specimens and bloodlines. I want you to picture this. Charles hunched over a desk at 3 a.m, candle burning low, his hand cramping as he transcribed his father's handwriting, knowing that if Richard caught him, he'd be disinherited or worse. He collected physical evidence, too. He stole several pages from Dr. Pemberton's medical journals during a house visit, documents that explicitly described examinations of enslaved women for breeding purposes by Colonel Thornhill. He interviewed Miriam directly in 1859, a conversation that lasted 3 hours in the plantation's chapel while Richard was away. She told him everything: the rapes, the forced pregnancies, the other women, and most importantly, she confirmed that Samuel, now 11 years old, was undeniably Richard's biological son. Charles documented it all in a secret cache hidden in the plantation's old smokehouse. Now I need you to pause for a moment, because what comes next is going to shift everything you think you understand about this story. Can you handle what comes next? Because this is where the story turns truly chilling, where revenge becomes inheritance, where the abused become the weapon, and where the very system designed to protect white supremacy becomes the instrument of its own destruction. If you're still with me, hit that like button right now. This investigation took me months of research through courthouse records, plantation ledgers, and family documents that were deliberately hidden from history. Drop a comment telling me if you think what Charles did next was justice or just another form of cruelty. And if you want to see the uncensored documents, the actual ledger pages and legal papers that prove this happened, become a member for exclusive access. Trust me, you're going to want to see the receipts for what I'm about to tell you. The damning evidence came in February 1860. And it wasn't what Charles expected. It was far worse and far more useful. Richard had suffered a minor stroke, nothing fatal but enough to leave him bedridden for a week. And in his paranoid, weakened state, he'd asked Charles to retrieve certain important documents from the bank in Charleston. Charles went, but he also requested access to his father's private safe deposit box, forging Richard's signature with a hand steadied by years of practiced deception. Inside that metal box, he found Richard's true legacy, a last will and testament, dated 1855, that explicitly acknowledged Samuel as his biological son and bequeathed him a portion of the Thornhill estate in recognition of blood ties, though born of unfortunate circumstances. There were letters, too. Correspondence between Richard and attorneys in New Orleans and Savannah, exploring the legal possibility of manumitting Samuel and establishing him as a legitimate heir. Richard had been planning this for years, preparing to give his enslaved son legal recognition, property, and status that would elevate him above Charles entirely. Now you have to understand the magnitude of this discovery. This wasn't just evidence of rape. It was evidence of intent to disinherit Charles completely, to replace him with the child of an enslaved woman. Charles stood in that Charleston bank vault, hands shaking as he read his father's elegant handwriting describing Samuel as my true heir, bearing my features and my mind, superior in every way to my unfortunate legitimate son. The betrayal was complete, documented, legally binding. Charles didn't return to Thornhill Plantation that night. He ran. He took the will, the letters, the safe deposit box contents, and rode hard for Savannah with the documents wrapped in oilcloth and hidden in his saddlebags. He knew the moment Richard discovered the theft, his life would be worthless. And he was right. By dawn, Richard had recovered enough to send Clayton Hodge and 3 armed overseers after his son with instructions that were chillingly simple. Retrieve the documents by any means necessary. I want you to picture this. Charles riding through February darkness, his horse lathered and exhausted, constantly looking over his shoulder for pursuers he knew were coming. He had maybe 12 hours head start. And he was riding toward Savannah because he'd already arranged, during one of his drunken trips to the city, for a lawyer named Abraham Coffin to hold documents in trust. Coffin was a Quaker, one of the few attorneys in Georgia with abolitionist sympathies, though he kept them carefully hidden. Charles reached Savannah by noon, stumbled into Coffin's office covered in road dust and sweat, and shoved the documents across the desk. "Copy everything. Tonight, keep the originals in your vault," Charles gasped. 3 hours later, Hodge and the overseers arrived in Savannah, searching hotels and taverns. They found Charles at a boarding house near the docks, drunk or pretending to be. They beat him savagely in the alley behind the building, demanded the documents. Charles laughed through broken teeth and told them they were already too late. Charles returned to Charleston society in March 1860 with copies of his father's documents, expecting vindication, expecting outrage, expecting someone in power to care that Richard Thornhill had systematically raped enslaved women and planned to legitimize a mixed-race heir. He was catastrophically wrong. He presented his evidence to Judge Whitmore again, laid out the will, the letters, the breeding ledgers. The judge examined everything with meticulous care, then looked up with an expression of profound disappointment. Not at Richard, but at Charles. "Your father's private arrangements with his property are his own business," Whitmore said slowly. "But you, Charles, have committed theft. You've stolen legal documents from your father's safe deposit box. You've violated his privacy, and you're attempting to publicly humiliate a respected member of Charleston society. Let's be real. This was the reversal Charles should have anticipated. The documents that proved his father's depravity were inadmissible because Charles had obtained them illegally. Worse, Charleston's elites circled the wagons around Richard. Within a week, Charles found himself socially ostracized completely. His club membership was revoked. Former friends crossed the street to avoid him. Anonymous letters arrived calling him an ungrateful son, a traitor to his class, a man who'd betrayed his own father over minor indiscretions with property. The Charleston Mercury even published an editorial without naming Charles directly, condemning sons who aired family grievances publicly and threatened the sacred institution of patriarchal authority. Charles had brought proof of atrocity to civilization, and civilization had chosen the monster over the witness. There was no official raid, not in 1860, not during the Civil War, not ever during Richard Thornhill's lifetime. This is where the story diverges from the justice we want and enters the crushing reality of what actually happened. The breeding house continued operating until 1862, when Union gunboats began shelling coastal South Carolina and Richard finally dismantled it, not out of conscience but out of fear that invading troops might discover evidence. But let me tell you what was found years later. In 1866, after Richard's death, when Union occupation forces and Freedmen's Bureau agents actually entered Thornhill Plantation with legal authority, they discovered the breeding house still standing, its doors unlocked, its rooms empty but preserved like a museum of horror. The beds remained, their rope frames sagging, dark stains on mattresses that no one wanted to examine too closely. Shackles were bolted to the floor in 2 rooms. Richard had apparently restrained women who fought too violently. The agents found Dr. Pemberton's medical equipment still in a cabinet: speculums, forceps, syringes for forced examinations, bottles of laudanum used to sedate resistant women. Most damning were the ledgers, which Richard had hidden in a false wall but not destroyed. Bureau agent Marcus Webb documented everything in his official report. The breeding house at Thornhill Plantation represents systematic sexual violence on a scale rarely documented. Colonel Thornhill maintained detailed records of assaults spanning 15 years, involving at least 23 enslaved women, resulting in approximately 38 children of mixed race, many of whom he sold to other plantations to hide evidence of his paternity. Richard Thornhill died in October 1863, not from justice but from natural causes, a massive stroke that killed him in his sleep at age 68. He never faced trial, never answered for his crimes, never spent a single day in prison. He died in his own bed, surrounded by mahogany furniture and imported silk curtains, having lived his entire life as a respected pillar of Charleston society. Let that sink in. But here's what the post-war investigations revealed about the man behind the colonel's uniform. Richard had been doing this since at least 1842, 5 years before Charles witnessed the assault on Miriam. The earliest ledger entries documented experiments with enslaved women on his father's plantation before he'd even inherited Thornhill. He'd studied breeding manuals obsessively, had corresponded with other plantation owners about improving stock, and had even visited a notorious Louisiana plantation known for systematic rape, disguised as breeding programs. Dr. Silas Pemberton's mask slipped during Reconstruction when he was called before a freedmen's Bureau hearing in 1867. Facing potential criminal charges, he testified that Richard had paid him over $3,000 across 20 years to provide medical cover for sexual violence. Pemberton admitted to conducting forced examinations, confirming pregnancies resulting from rape, and once performing an abortion on a woman who'd been impregnated by Richard but was deemed unsuitable for producing quality offspring. Pemberton's medical license was revoked, but he never saw the inside of a jail cell. He fled to Texas and resumed practice under an assumed name. The Freedmen's Bureau investigation didn't stop at Thornhill Plantation. It couldn't, because the evidence pointed to something far more organized and widespread. Richard's correspondence revealed connections to at least 7 other plantation owners across South Carolina, Georgia, and Louisiana, who were running similar breeding programs with the same calculated methodology. They'd formed what they called the Agricultural Improvement Society, which sounds innocent until you read the meeting minutes. Discovered in a Charleston warehouse in 1868, these men met quarterly to discuss breeding techniques, share successful genetic combinations, and even trade enslaved women like livestock to introduce fresh bloodlines. Now, you have to understand, this wasn't some secret conspiracy. It was hiding in plain sight. They published their findings in agricultural journals, presented papers at Southern farming conventions, and received awards for innovation in labor force management. The scope was staggering. Bureau investigators estimated that this network had systematically raped and impregnated over 300 enslaved women between 1840 and 1865, producing more than 500 mixed-race children who were either kept as specially trained slaves or sold at premium prices to buyers who valued light-skinned workers. The financial records showed these children sold for 50 to 100% more than other enslaved people of similar age. There was even evidence of international connections. Richard had corresponded with a Brazilian plantation owner and a Cuban sugar baron about their breeding programs, sharing techniques across borders. creating a transnational system of organized sexual violence cloaked in agricultural science. But here's what makes this truly sickening. Everyone knew. Not suspected, not wondered, but knew. Charleston society, the churches, the legal establishment, the medical community. They all knew what Richard Thornhill and men like him were doing, and they collectively chose silence. Let's be real about this conspiracy. It wasn't organized in smoke-filled rooms. It was embedded in the very fabric of antebellum Southern culture. When Charles tried to expose his father in 1860, he wasn't met with shock or disbelief. He was met with anger that he'd violated the unspoken agreement to never speak about it publicly. Ministers who preached about Christian morality on Sundays knew their wealthiest parishioners were raping enslaved women and said nothing because those men funded their churches. Judges who could have prosecuted under existing adultery or fornication laws chose not to, because those laws were never intended to protect black women. Doctors like Pemberton provided medical cover because it was profitable and socially acceptable. Even Northern abolitionists, when they discovered evidence of breeding programs during the war, often buried the details because the sexual violence was considered too inflammatory, too graphic for public consumption. They feared it would distract from the respectable arguments against slavery. After the war, during Reconstruction, there was a brief window when these crimes could have been fully exposed and prosecuted. But white Southerners were obsessed with redemption and restoring their honor, so they burned records, intimidated witnesses, and created a mythological narrative of noble plantation life that erased the breeding houses from history entirely. Charles Thornhill lived until 1891. Dying at 58 from cirrhosis of the liver. The alcohol finally killed him. But before he died, he did one thing that mattered. He honored a promise he'd made to Miriam decades earlier. When Richard died in 1863, Charles inherited Thornhill Plantation by default as the legitimate white heir, and one of his first acts after the Emancipation Proclamation was to legally acknowledge Samuel as Richard's biological son in county records. It wasn't justice. It was spite directed at his dead father's legacy. Samuel, who was 15 when freed, eventually sued for a portion of the Thornhill estate in 1870, using the very documents Charles had stolen and the will Richard had hidden. The case dragged through South Carolina courts for 7 years. And here's where the revenge becomes complete. In 1877, a Reconstruction-era judge ruled that Samuel was entitled to 30% of the estate's value because Richard had acknowledged him as his son in legally binding documents. And South Carolina inheritance law didn't explicitly prohibit mixed-race children from inheriting if paternity was proven. The Thornhill fortune, built on 1,200 acres and hundreds of enslaved people, was legally required to pay Samuel Thornhill approximately $47,000. Now, you have to understand what this meant. A formerly enslaved child of rape had successfully claimed his white father's fortune, using the same legal system that had once defined him as property. The remaining Thornhill family was financially devastated, forced to sell off huge portions of the plantation to pay the settlement. Samuel Thornhill took that $47,000 and did something his biological father never could have imagined. He used it to destroy everything Richard had built. He purchased portions of the Thornhill plantation at auction, then immediately sold them to formerly enslaved families at prices they could actually afford, essentially redistributing the land his father had used for cotton and human suffering. He funded schools for black children across South Carolina, paid for legal assistance to freedmen fighting discriminatory laws, and became a prominent figure in Reconstruction politics, serving 2 terms in the state legislature. The moral here isn't simple or satisfying. This isn't a story about justice prevailing, because justice would have meant Richard Thornhill facing consequences while alive, would have meant Miriam and the other women receiving reparations and acknowledgement of their trauma. Instead, this is a story about how systems of oppression can occasionally be weaponized against themselves, how a child born from violence can choose to become something other than a perpetuation of that violence. But let's be real, for every Samuel Thornhill who successfully claimed his inheritance, there were thousands of mixed-race children who died enslaved, who were sold away from their mothers, who never knew their white fathers' names, who had no Charles Thornhill to steal documents on their behalf. The Thornhill case became infamous precisely because it was exceptional, because it violated every expectation of how these stories were supposed to end. Samuel lived until 1923, dying at 75. having transformed blood money into black liberation. So here's the question that should keep you awake tonight. How many other Richard Thornhills were there? How many breeding houses existed on plantations across the South that were dismantled before anyone documented them? How many mixed-race children bore their white father's features but died as property, their true parentage erased from history? And here's the truly disturbing part: we know the answer. Genetic studies conducted in the 2000s revealed that approximately 30% of African Americans have European ancestry, much of it tracing back to the slavery era, which means millions of people today are descendants of systematic rape disguised as breeding programs. Those children existed. Those women suffered. And American society conspired to forget it all. If this story disturbed you, and it should have, then subscribe right now. Because next week we're diving into something even darker. The town in Mississippi, where prominent white families formed a secret society that continued kidnapping and enslaving black citizens 20 years after the 13th Amendment. We have the court documents. We have the testimony. We have names. Drop a comment telling me, do you think Samuel's revenge was enough? Was taking the money justice, or should he have pushed for criminal prosecutions? Hit that like button if you made it this far, and become a member for access to the unredacted Freedmen's Bureau reports. Trust me, what I couldn't say in this video will haunt you. The truth is always worse than we imagine, and someone needs to remember these names.